The homeless veteran saved a frozen dog in the storm. What happened next shocked everyone. There are moments when the world goes quiet before it roars, when the cold has a sound all its own. And if you've ever stood in the shadow of mountains with winter pressing against your chest, you know that silence, the kind that smells of iron and coming snow. This is a story about one such moment, about a man the world had forgotten and a storm that remembered him. If stories of quiet courage warm your heart, subscribe and tell us where you're listening from. Our dream is to reach 1,000 hearts by the fire, and maybe, just maybe, yours is one of them. His name was Marcus, though few people had spoken it in years, and he lived in an abandoned railcar at the edge of the Montana wilderness, where the track had rusted into the earth and the trains had stopped running long before he was born. The railcar was red once, or perhaps orange, but time and weather had turned it the color of old blood, and inside it smelled of wood smoke and dampness, of coffee grounds reused too many times, of a life lived small and careful. He had a sleeping bag that had seen better wars, a cast-iron skillet older than his own scars, and a coat, heavy, military issue, the kind that carried weight even when your pockets were empty. November had come early that year, the way it does in the high country, and the mountains wore their snow like a warning. Marcus rose before dawn each day, not because he wanted to, but because the cold demanded it, because stillness meant freezing, and freezing meant the end of small things. He split wood with an axe he'd found in a burned-out barn 3 winters back, and each swing was a prayer of sorts, a conversation between his body and the world that had no words, only the crack of iron against pine, only the smell of sap and effort. He rationed his food the way soldiers do. A can of beans stretched across 2 days, stale bread softened in melted snow, instant coffee, so weak it was more ritual than warmth. The sky that morning was the color of a bruise, purple and gray and swollen with intent, and Marcus stood outside the railcar with his hands wrapped around a tin cup, watching the clouds roll in from the west like a slow verdict. The wind had teeth. It bit through his coat, through his flannel, through the layers of forgetting he'd wrapped around himself. And he knew, felt it in his knees, in the old shrapnel wound beneath his ribs, that the storm would be a bad one. He thought about going into town, about the shelter with its fluorescent lights and the questions people asked with their eyes, and he decided, as he always did, that the cold was kinder. By noon the first flakes were falling, fat and lazy, the kind that seem almost gentle until you realize they're scouts for something bigger. Marcus brought an extra wood, stacked it against the rail car's inner wall where the rust had eaten through to memory, and he filled every container he had with snow to melt for water. He checked his supplies. 2 cans of soup, half a loaf of bread going hard, a jar of peanut butter with maybe 3 days left at the bottom. Enough. It was always enough, or it had to be. He lit a small fire in the wood stove he'd built from scavenged metal, and he sat on the edge of his cot, watching the flames through the grate, thinking about nothing and everything, the way men do when they've learned that memory is both enemy and friend. The storm arrived just after dark, and it came the way storms do in the mountains, not gradually, but all at once, as if the sky had been holding its breath and finally let go. The wind howled against the rail car, a sound like wolves or women weeping, and the snow fell so thick it erased the world beyond the frosted window. Marcus lay in his sleeping bag, listening to the metal groan and shiver, listening to his own breath fog in the firelight, and he thought about warmth the way a man in the desert thinks about water, not as a comfort, but as a country he'd once known and could no longer find. Morning came late, if it came at all, the light filtering through snow-caked glass like a rumor of sun, and Marcus woke to a world remade in white, the kind of white that has weight in presence, that presses against the eyes and makes you wonder if color was ever real. The storm had not stopped. If anything, it had deepened, grown more committed to its work, and the drifts outside the rail car rose past the windows, sealing him in a capsule of rust and memory. He stoked the fire with wood that hissed and popped, melted snow for coffee, ate a piece of bread so slowly it became a meditation. It was midday, or what he guessed was midday by the gray light's reluctant climb, when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to wind or snow or the creak of old metal settling. At first he thought it was the storm playing tricks, the way isolation makes ghosts of ordinary things. But then it came again, clearer this time, a cry that was neither human nor entirely animal, a sound that carried pain the way smoke carries fire. Marcus stood, his body stiff from cold and old injuries, and he pulled on his coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit him like a fist, stole his breath, filled his lungs with ice, and for a moment he couldn't see anything but white, couldn't hear anything but the roar of winter announcing itself. He steadied himself against the rail car's side, felt the frozen metal burn through his gloves, and he listened. There again, to the east, maybe 30 yards, maybe more, something was crying in the white. He moved toward it, each step a small battle against drifts that rose to his thighs, against wind that wanted to turn him back, against the reasonable voice in his head that said a man alone in a blizzard has no business playing hero. He found the dog half buried in snow, near the trunk of a pine that had fallen sometime in the night, and at first he thought it was dead, just another casualty of a world that took more than it gave. But then he saw the ribs move, shallow and slow, saw the matted fur rise and fall like a tide, almost finished. The dog was medium-sized, maybe a mutt, maybe something that had been cared for once, its coat a patchwork of brown and white now crusted with ice. Its eyes were closed, its paws tucked beneath it, as if trying to hold onto the last bit of warmth it had known. Marcus knelt in the snow, his knees cracking like old wood, and he reached out with one gloved hand, touched the dog's side gently, the way you touch something sacred or broken. The dog didn't move, didn't flinch, and for a moment Marcus felt the weight of all the things he'd failed to save pressing against his chest. Brothers who didn't come home, a marriage that dissolved like sugar and rain, a life that had promised more than it delivered. But then the dog's eye opened, just one, and it looked at him with something that wasn't quite trust, but wasn't quite fear either, something that lived in the space between giving up and holding on. He didn't think. Thinking was for people who still believed in good decisions. He simply lifted the dog, felt its weight against his chest, too light, far too light. And he carried it back through the storm, back to the rail car, back to the small circle of warmth and firelight that passed for home. The dog didn't struggle, didn't make a sound, and Marcus wondered if it knew, somehow, that they were the same, two creatures the world had left out in the cold, two survivors of storms that had nothing to do with weather. Inside, he laid the dog near the wood stove, not too close, but close enough, and he wrapped it in the spare blanket he kept for the worst nights, the one that still smelled faintly of his mother's house, of a time before the war and the forgetting. He melted more snow, warmed it to lukewarm, and he dipped his fingers in the water and wet the dog's mouth, its cracked nose, the way you baptize something back into the world of the living. The dog's tongue moved, just slightly, and Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years, something small and fierce and entirely unexpected. Hope, maybe, or just the stubborn refusal to let the cold win again. The dog didn't die that first night, or the second, and by the third day it had lifted its head, had drunk water from Marcus's cupped hands, had eaten small pieces of bread softened in broth made from the last can of chicken soup. Marcus gave it half of everything he had, which wasn't much, but then again he'd lived on less, had learned in the desert and the mountains that the body could survive on almost nothing if the will was fed. He named the dog Soldier, not because it was clever, but because it was true, because they'd both fought battles no one talked about and carried scars no one asked to see. The storm raged for 3 more days, and in that time the rail car became a world entire, a small republic of warmth and careful rationing, of silence broken only by the crackle of fire and the sound of breathing, one human and one not, both ragged and determined. Marcus found himself talking to the dog the way men talk when there's no one to judge the words, telling stories about nothing and everything, about the boy he'd been in Idaho, about his father who'd worked timber and died with sawdust in his lungs, about the girl he'd married at 22 who'd loved him before the war taught him to flinch at loud noises and sleep with one eye open. He told the dog about Afghanistan, though he'd never told anyone else, about the mountains there that looked like these but felt different, about the friends whose names he whispered sometimes in the dark, about the day the IED turned his Humvee into flying metal and sent him home with a purple heart and a head that wouldn't stop replaying the same 10 seconds over and over. He told the dog about the VA hospital, about the pills that made him feel like he was underwater, about the apartment he'd lost when the rent went up and the disability check didn't, about the slow, quiet way a man could disappear in a country that thanked him for his service and then looked away. The dog listened, or seemed to, its dark eyes following Marcus around the rail car. And there was something in that gaze that felt like understanding, like maybe pain had a language that didn't need translation. Marcus remembered, couldn't help but remember, the man who'd found him 5 years ago, after the eviction, after he'd spent 2 weeks sleeping in his car until the car got impounded too. An old rancher named Frank, who'd seen Marcus parked by the side of the highway, and had simply said, "You need work or you need food?" Marcus had said both, and Frank had given him both, had let him sleep in a barn and mend fences for 3 months until the cancer took Frank fast and mean, leaving Marcus with $500 in an envelope and nowhere to go but the rail car someone mentioned once in town. He thought about Frank while he watched Soldier heal, watched the dog's ribs become less visible, watched it stand on shaky legs, and take 3 steps before collapsing back into the blanket. He thought about how Frank had never asked about the war, had never pushed, had just offered work in silence and the occasional cup of coffee, so strong it could wake the dead. He thought about how being saved didn't always look like rescue. Sometimes it just looked like someone deciding you were worth the trouble of not giving up on. By the time the storm cleared, Soldier could walk from one end of the rail car to the other, could eat from Marcus's hand without trembling, could sleep without whimpering through dreams that smelled like fear and snow. If this moment touches you, please subscribe. It helps these quiet stories be heard, helps us believe that small acts of kindness still matter in a world that sometimes feels frozen solid. Marcus stood outside in the new silence, the storm gone as suddenly as it had come, and he watched Soldier sniff the air, watched its tail move just slightly, just enough, and he felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been frozen for longer than he cared to admit. Not happiness, exactly, but its cousin, something like purpose, like maybe saving one small life in the middle of nowhere meant he wasn't as lost as he'd thought. The sky after a storm is a different sky, cleaner somehow, as if the snow had scrubbed the air of everything except light and cold and the sharp smell of pine. Marcus spent the morning digging out the rail car, shoveling pathways through drifts that came to his chest, and Soldier stayed close, limping slightly, but moving with the determination of a creature that had decided to live. They shared a breakfast of oatmeal cooked thin, and Marcus talked to the dog about nothing. About the way the sun hit the mountains, about the crow that had watched them from the pine branch, about how spring would come eventually even though it felt impossible now. It was just past noon when he heard the engine, a sound so foreign after days of silence that at first he thought he'd imagined it. But then he saw it. A truck making its way slowly down the old access road, 4-wheel drive churning through the snow, and Marcus felt his shoulders tighten the way they always did when the world came calling. He stepped in front of the rail car, shielding Soldier behind him without thinking about it, and he waited. The truck stopped maybe 20 yards away, and a woman climbed out bundled in a heavy parka, her breath fogging in the cold air. She was maybe 40, maybe younger. Hard to tell when winter aged everyone, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that looked like they hadn't slept well in months. She raised one hand in a gesture that was part greeting, part question, and she called out, "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm looking for my dog." The words hung in the air between them, and Marcus felt something drop in his stomach, something that felt like the moment before bad news becomes real. Behind him, Soldier whined softly, and the woman's face changed, broken as something between relief and grief, and she took 3 steps forward before stopping herself, before remembering that this was a stranger's property, such as it was, and that you didn't run at a man who lived alone in the mountains. "That's him," she said, her voice catching slightly. "That's Charlie. He's been missing for 6 days. We were camping up by Silver Creek, and he ran off during the storm, and She stopped, swallowed, started again. "I've been searching everywhere. I didn't think I'd find him alive." Marcus looked down at Soldier, at Charlie, and the dog looked back at him, and in that moment Marcus understood the shape of loss in a way he'd forgotten he could, the way it carved you hollow and left you standing. He nodded slowly, and he said, "He was pretty far gone when I found him. Took a few days to come back." The woman came closer, dropped to her knees in the snow, and Charlie, soldier, moved toward her with that same limping gait, and the woman wrapped her arms around the dog and made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, the kind of sound that comes from somewhere deeper than words. Marcus watched, feeling like an intruder in a moment that had nothing to do with him, and he turned to go back into the rail car, to give them privacy, to let the dog go back to where it belonged. "Wait," the woman said, standing, one hand still on Charlie's head. "I don't know how to thank you. You saved his life." "You." She paused, looked at him more carefully, at the old military coat, at the rail car behind him, at the careful way he held himself like a man used to being invisible. "You live here." Marcus shrugged, a gesture that meant everything and nothing. For now, she was quiet for a moment, and he could see her thinking, weighing something, making calculations that people made when they looked at men like him. Then she said, "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I have a ranch about 8 miles north of here, near the state road. My husband passed away 4 months ago, and I've been trying to keep the place running, but there's so much that needs fixing, and She stopped, seemed to realize she was talking too much, too fast. "I could use help. If you're looking for work. Room in the barn, 3 meals, fair pay." Marcus looked at her, at the hope and desperation she was trying to hide, and he looked at Charlie, who stood between them like a bridge between two countries, and he felt the old wariness rise up in his chest, the instinct that said accepting help meant owing something, meant being seen, meant risking the small, careful life he'd built in the rail car. But he also felt something else, something that had started the night. He'd carried a frozen dog through a blizzard and decided that saving one small thing might matter after all. "I'll think about it," he said, which was more than he'd meant to say, more than he'd offered anyone in years. Sarah nodded, understanding that this was the best she'd get right now, and she reached in her pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, wrote something on it with a pen that barely worked in the cold. "That's my number and the address. If you change your mind." She handed it to him, and their fingers touched briefly through their gloves, and Marcus felt the warmth of another person's life, felt how strange and how necessary it was. She loaded Charlie into the truck, and the dog looked back at Marcus through the rear window, and Marcus raised one hand in a gesture that might have been goodbye, or might have been something else, something without a name. The truck pulled away, churning snow, and Marcus stood in the silence it left behind, holding a piece of paper with an address on it, and he wondered if this was how second chances always arrived. Unexpected, inconvenient, and impossible to refuse. That night Marcus couldn't sleep, which was nothing new. Sleep had been a stranger to him for years, something that came in shallow pools and left him exhausted. But this was different. He lay in his sleeping bag, staring at the rust-stained ceiling of the rail car, and he thought about the woman, about Sarah, about the way she'd looked at him not with pity, but with something closer to recognition, like maybe she understood what it meant to be barely holding on. He thought about Charlie, about how the dog had looked back at him, about how 3 days of care could create a bond that felt bigger than the time it took to build it. He thought about the ranch, about what it would mean to leave the rail car, to step back into the world of obligations and expectations, of people who would see him and maybe ask questions he didn't want to answer. He thought about the barn she'd mentioned, about room and meals, about work that meant something other than just surviving another winter. And he thought about the piece of paper in his coat pocket, about the address written in handwriting that slanted slightly to the right, about how easy it would be to throw it in the fire and pretend the conversation had never happened. But he didn't. He kept the paper, and in the morning he washed as best he could with melted snow and a rag, and he shaved with a razor that had seen better years, and he looked at himself in the piece of mirror he kept propped against the window, and he saw a man who was 43 but looked older, a man with gray in his beard and lines around his eyes that came from squinting into too many suns in too many countries. He saw a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be part of something larger than survival, and he wondered if that man was worth the trouble Sarah Mitchell seemed to think he was. He walked the 8 miles to the ranch because he didn't have gas money and because walking gave him time to change his mind, to turn back, to convince himself that this was a mistake. But he kept walking, following the directions she'd written, and by midday he stood at the edge of her property, looking at a house that needed paint and a barn that listed slightly to the left, at fences that had gaps where the wire had rusted through, at fields that would need tending come spring. It looked like hard work. It looked like a place that needed someone to care about it. Sarah came out of the house when she saw him standing there, and she didn't smile exactly, but something in her face eased, and she said, "You came." "Thought I'd take a look at what needs doing," Marcus said, which was easier than saying he'd come because he had nowhere else to go, because a dog had looked at him like it mattered, because sometimes you say yes to things not because they make sense, but because they're the only door still open. She showed him the barn, the room in the back that had a cot and a wood stove and a window that looked out of the mountains. And it was more than the rail car, warmer, cleaner, but Marcus felt the weight of it, felt how accepting this meant stepping back into the shape of a man who worked and ate and slept in places people knew about. Sarah told him about the roof that needed patching, about the fence posts that needed replacing, about the tractor that wouldn't start, and Marcus nodded, his mind already working through the problems the way it used to work through tactics and logistics, the way it remembered how to be useful. They were walking back toward the house when Sarah stopped, looked at his coat more carefully, at the patch on the shoulder that was faded but still visible, the insignia of his unit, the one he'd served with for 2 tours before everything went wrong. She reached out, not touching but almost, and she said, "My husband was Army. 2nd Infantry Division. He came back different, the way you all do, and he tried so hard to be okay, but the okay kept getting further away." Marcus felt something tighten in his throat, felt the familiar shape of grief that wasn't quite his own, but felt like it belonged to him anyway. "I'm sorry," he said, because it was all there was to say, because men who'd been to war understood that sorry meant, "I know what that weight feels like. I know what it costs to carry it." "He would have liked you," Sarah said. And there was something in her voice that made Marcus look at her more closely, made him see the way her own grief sat in her shoulders, in the careful way she held herself together. "He would have said you had good hands." That's what he always said about people, whether they had good hands or not. Marcus looked down at his hands, at the scars and calluses, at the way they'd learned to split wood and start fires and do small, necessary things, and he wondered if they were good hands or just tired ones, if there was a difference. Charlie came bounding out from behind the barn, moving better now, his limp almost gone, and he ran straight to Marcus, pressed against his legs in a greeting that felt like forgiveness or gratitude, or maybe just the simple fact of recognition. Sarah watched, and something in her face shifted, softened, and she said, "He likes you. Charlie's a good judge of character. Better than me, probably." She paused, then added, "I know what it's like to feel lost. After John died, I didn't think I'd find a reason to keep going. But then I realized the ranch needed me, and maybe I needed it too, and maybe that's enough, just needing and being needed." Marcus knelt down, ran his hand over Charlie's head, felt the dog lean into his touch, and he thought about need, about how it could be a weight or a lifeline depending on how you carried it. He thought about Sarah offering him work not out of charity, but out of her own necessity, out of the honest admission that some things can't be done alone. And he thought about the storm, about how it had brought him a frozen dog and a reason to step outside himself, even if just for a moment, even if just to save one small life in the middle of winter. "I'll stay," he said, the words coming out quieter than he intended. And Sarah nodded, and Charlie wagged his tail, and somewhere in the distance a crow called out across the snow, and Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in so long he'd almost forgotten its name. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't finished yet, that there were still chapters left to write in a story he'd thought was over. The work came slowly at first, the way trust does between people who have learned that promises break and plans dissolve. But Marcus found a rhythm in the days that followed, a cadence of hammer and nail, of fence wire pulled taut, of mornings that began before light, and ended with muscles that remembered what it felt like to be used for something other than just carrying weight. He fixed the barn roof first, replacing shingles that had blown off in storms no one had been there to witness, and he worked carefully, methodically, the way he'd been taught in another life, measuring twice and cutting once, understanding that good work was its own kind of prayer, its own quiet conversation with a world that didn't often listen. Sarah brought him coffee in the mornings, strong and black the way he liked it, and they didn't talk much at first, just stood together watching the sun climb over the mountains, watching the way light changed the color of snow from blue to gold to white, so bright it hurt to look it directly. She told him small things, where the tools were kept, which fence line needed attention first, how the tractor's engine flooded if he didn't pump the gas just right. And he listened the way men listen when they've learned that instructions are a form of trust, that being told how things work means someone believes you'll still be there tomorrow. Charlie followed Marcus everywhere, a shadow with 4 legs and a tail that wagged whenever Marcus looked his way. And there was something in that constancy that Marcus hadn't realized he needed, something that reminded him that loyalty didn't have to be earned through grand gestures, that sometimes it was just the quiet decision to show up day after day, to sit beside someone while they worked and ask for nothing but presence in return. He talked to the dog while he mended fences, told him about the posts that needed replacing, about the way you had to dig deep enough that the frost wouldn't heave them out come spring. And Charlie listened, or seemed to, his dark eyes following Marcus's hands as they worked. The people in town noticed, the way small towns always do, the way gossip travels faster than weather through places where everyone knows everyone else's business. They saw Sarah's truck at the feed store with Marcus sitting in the passenger seat, saw him loading lumber at the hardware store, saw the two of them at the diner on a Saturday morning, sitting across from each other with coffee and pancakes and a conversation that looked easy, comfortable, like maybe grief had found a companion and loneliness had found a reprieve. Some people whispered, wondered what a widow was doing with a homeless veteran, wondered if it was charity or something else, wondered if Marcus was trouble or salvation or just a man trying to earn his keep. But Sarah didn't care what they whispered, and neither did Marcus, because they'd both learned that the opinions of people who hadn't stood where they'd stood, who hadn't lost what they'd lost, carried about as much weight as smoke. She told him one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, about John, about how he'd come home from his second deployment with nightmares that turned their bedroom into a battlefield, about how he'd tried to drink the memories away, and when that didn't work, had tried to work them away, had pushed himself so hard that his heart gave out at 47, left her alone with a ranch and a mortgage and a grief so big she couldn't see around it. Marcus listened, didn't offer platitudes or easy comfort, just nodded and said, "The war doesn't end when you come home. It just changes location." And Sarah looked at him with eyes that understood, that had seen this truth played out in her own kitchen, in her own bed, in the slow unraveling of a man she'd loved. John would have liked knowing someone like you was here, she said, and Marcus heard in those words not just gratitude, but something deeper, an acknowledgement that some debts get paid forward, that helping one veteran was a way of honoring another, that the living carry the dead not as burden, but as witness. The weeks passed and became a month, and Marcus moved from the barn room into a small cottage at the edge of Sarah's property, a place that had been used for seasonal workers once, that had a kitchen and a bathroom and heat that came from baseboards instead of a wood stove. It felt strange at first, almost too comfortable, and he caught himself sometimes wondering when it would end, when the offer would be rescinded, when he'd find himself back in a rail car or on the road or in some other forgotten place. But Sarah seemed to need him as much as he needed the work, seemed to find in his quiet competence a kind of anchor, and slowly, carefully, Marcus allowed himself to believe that maybe this wasn't temporary, that maybe some things were allowed to last. He started attending the small church on the edge of town, not because he found faith again, but because Sarah went and had asked if he'd like to come along, and he figured that sitting in a pew for an hour was a small price to pay for the life he'd been given. The pastor was an old man with kind eyes and a voice that never pushed, who talked about grace in ways that made it sound less like judgment and more like breath, like the simple fact of being allowed to try again. Marcus sat in the back, Charlie at his feet. The church allowed dogs, said all of God's creatures were welcome. And he listened to him sung off-key by people who looked as tired and as hopeful as he felt, and he thought about redemption, about whether it was something you earned or something you simply accepted when it showed up unexpected in a storm. One Sunday, after the service, a man approached him, older, maybe 70, with a VFW cap and a handshake that was firm and brief. And he said, "I know that look. That's the look of a man who's been somewhere he can't talk about." And Marcus nodded, not knowing what to say, and the old man just smiled and said, "Welcome home, son. Glad you made it back." And Marcus felt something break loose in his chest, something that had been held too tight for too long. And he realized that maybe making it back wasn't about geography or time. Maybe it was just about finding a place where someone recognized you and called you home anyway. If this journey has moved you, if stories of second chances and quiet rebuilding speak to something in your own heart, we'd be honored if you'd subscribe. Not just for us, but for all the voices still finding their way back, for the 1,000 hearts by the fire we're trying to reach, one story at a time. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight, whether you're in a city that never sleeps or a town where everyone knows your name. Because knowing you're out there, that these words find you wherever you are, that's what makes the telling matter. Spring came the way it always does in the mountains, reluctantly, stubbornly, with false starts and setbacks, with snow that melted only to return, with mornings that smelled of mud and pine sap, and the earth remembering how to breathe. Marcus and Sarah worked the land together, turning soil that had been frozen for months, mending the last of the fences, planting a garden that Sarah said would give them tomatoes and beans and squash come summer if they were lucky, and if the deer didn't get to it first. Charlie ran between the rows, chasing butterflies and his own shadow, and Marcus watched him with something close to contentment, thinking how strange it was that a dog half frozen in a storm had become the thread that pulled his life back together, that saved him by needing to be saved. The ranch began to look cared for again, the way places do when someone invests time and attention, when work is done not out of obligation, but out of something closer to love. The barn stood straight, its roof solid against whatever weather came next. The fences no longer sagged. The tractor ran, and the fields waited, patient and expectant. Sarah hired 2 seasonal workers for the summer, young men from town who needed work and didn't ask too many questions. And Marcus showed them how to stack hay and fix irrigation lines, showed them the kind of work that built a life one small task at a time. Evenings they sat on the porch, Marcus and Sarah, sometimes talking and sometimes not, watching the light change on the mountains, watching the sky turn from blue to purple to that particular darkness that's not quite black but holds the memory of day. They talked about small things, what needed doing tomorrow, whether the weather would hold, if the garden was getting enough water. And they talked about bigger things too, though less often, about what it meant to start over, about whether healing was something that happened to you or something you had to choose every day, about how grief never really left, but sometimes learned to share space with other things, with gratitude and purpose and the simple fact of another sunrise. Marcus thought often about the rail car, about the man he'd been when he lived there, about how that life had felt both necessary and impossible, like a holding pattern that couldn't last but couldn't end. He thought about the moment he'd heard Charlie crying in the storm, about how easy it would have been to turn back, to let the cold and the wind make the decision for him, about how one choice, to step into the blizzard, to carry something broken back to warmth, had changed everything that came after. He didn't know if he believed in fate or providence, or whatever name people gave to the way small moments could redirect entire lives. But he believed in showing up, in doing the next right thing, even when you couldn't see where it led. And maybe that was enough. Sarah told him one evening, as the sun set and the air grew cool enough that they pulled blankets over their laps, that she was thinking about expanding the ranch, about buying the adjacent property that had been empty for years, about running cattle again the way John had always wanted to but never got the chance. "I need help," she said, not quite looking at him. And Marcus understood that this was an offer, an invitation to stay not just for a season, but for something longer, something that looked like partnership, like building something together that neither of them could build alone. "I'm not going anywhere," Marcus said, and the words felt true in a way that surprised him, felt like a vow or a promise, or maybe just the simple acknowledgement that he'd found a place that fit, that held him without asking him to be anything other than what he was, a man with scars and stories, with nightmares that still came sometimes but came less often now, with hands that knew how to work and a heart that was learning, slowly, carefully, how to let people in. The community embraced him gradually, the way small towns do, with nods at the hardware store and conversations at the diner, with invitations to help with a barn raising and a request to speak at the VFW about his time in service. He declined the speaking engagement. Couldn't imagine standing in front of people and making speeches about honor and sacrifice, when mostly what he remembered was fear and exhaustion and the faces of friends who didn't come home. But he helped with the barn raising, swung a hammer alongside men who'd never served but understood the value of showing up when your neighbor needed help. Charlie grew sleek and healthy, his ribs no longer visible, his limp completely gone, and he became something of a town mascot, the dog who'd survived a blizzard and brought together a widow and a veteran in the process. Children asked to pet him, and Marcus let them, watched their small hands run through Charlie's fur, watched the dog's tail wag with a joy that seemed inexhaustible, and he thought about resilience, about how it looked different on everyone, but always involved the decision to keep going, to not let the cold win, to believe that warmth existed even when you couldn't feel it. One night, as summer approached and the last snow finally melted from the highest peaks, Marcus sat by the fire in the cottage. A real fire, in a real fireplace, with what he'd split himself and stacked neatly beside the hearth, and he thought about the year that had passed, about everything that had changed since the storm. He thought about how he'd been a man living in an abandoned railcar, counting days and rationing hope. And now he was a man with work that mattered, with a place to sleep and food to eat and people who knew his name. He thought about how salvation didn't always look the way you expected, how it could arrive in a storm with four legs and a need for rescue, how helping something else survive could teach you that you were worth surviving too. If these quiet stories of rebuilding and second chances have found a place in your heart, if they've given you a moment of peace or a reason to believe that broken things can be made whole again, please subscribe. Help us reach our dream of 1,000 hearts by the fire, 1,000 souls who believe that kindness still matters, that small acts of courage still change lives. Tell us where you're listening from, what corner of this wide world has welcomed you tonight, because every voice matters. Every heart that finds these words becomes part of the story we're telling together. Marcus stepped outside, Charlie following as always, and he stood in the cool night air, watching stars emerge in a sky so clear it looked like you could reach up and touch eternity. He thought about Frank, the rancher who'd helped him years ago, about how generosity echoed forward in ways you couldn't predict, about how being saved once meant you could save someone else later, about how the debts we owe each other aren't meant to be repaid, but paid forward. He thought about Sarah, about John, about all the veterans who'd come home to silence and struggle, about how community was built one act of recognition at a time, one welcome home at a time. The wind moved through the pines, carrying the smell of earth and possibility, and Marcus felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. Not happiness, exactly, but its quieter cousin, something like peace, something like belonging, something like the understanding that home wasn't a place you returned to, but a place you built day by day, with your own two hands and the help of people who decided you were worth the trouble. The fire burned low behind him, and Charlie pressed against his leg, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called out across the darkness, and Marcus answered with his own silence, with his own gratitude, with the simple fact of still being here, still standing, still believing that tomorrow would come, and he would meet it, tired and scarred and hopeful, a forgotten soldier who'd finally remembered what it meant to be found. And maybe that's all any of us can hope for, to be seen when we're lost, to be helped when we're frozen, to be given work when we need purpose, and to find, in the midst of our own storms, that one small act of courage can redirect everything that comes after, can turn a blizzard into a bridge and loneliness into a life worth living. The story doesn't end here. Not really. It continues in every choice to show up, to help, to try again. But this is a good place to rest for tonight, a good place to let the fire burn down to embers and the words settle into silence, knowing that sometimes the best endings are just new beginnings wrapped in gratitude and the warm weight of a dog sleeping at your feet. Thank you for sitting with us by this fire, for lending us your heart for these few chapters, for believing that stories like Marcus's matter in a world that moves too fast and forgets too easily. Until we meet again, may you find your own warmth in the cold, your own purpose in the storms, and your own second chances when you need them most.